Buenas tardes. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today, Disasters in Puerto Rico and the Impact of the Diaspora. Today, we have a great lineup. Two of our best researchers, Carlos Vargas and Jennifer Hinojosa. Carlos is going to be talking about a report that he did with Charles Venator about Holyoke. Holyoke is one case study of how displacement and migration play out in the age of climate change.
Buenas tardes, damas y caballeros. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to present some findings from anticipated vulnerabilities, displacement, and migration in the age of climate change. These are lessons from the Hollyoaks, the city of Hollyoaks response to Hurricane Maria for the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. The effects of Hurricane Maria are still being felt in Puerto Rico as well as in Puerto Rican communities throughout the United States, 3 years after the storm devastated the island. So while Puerto Rico bore the overwhelming brunt of the cyclone, its impact was also felt in places in the United States in which Puerto Ricans have settled. With the increased mobility of people across countries, however, the effects of temporales are felt not only in the communities they directly hit, but also in communities to which residents of those communities turn to seek help. Hurricane Maria is an example of how a weather event that takes place in the Caribbean affects communities not just there, but also far and away. One such place was Holyoke in Western Massachusetts, 1,000 miles away from the Caribbean. The experiences of those displaced to the United States by the hurricane, as well as the relatives who provided them with safe haven in the United States, in addition to the civic and governmental sector that supported both the groups of the displaced and the group of the hosts, are gathered, and they did so in the weeks, months, and now years after the storm hit, are collected in, as I said, this report, Anticipated Vulnerabilities, which is a joint effort. It's a joint effort by the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and the Institute of Latino, Latin American, and Caribbean Studies of the University of Connecticut Stores. And my co-author is Charles Venator Santiago, a political scientist from that institution. Let me just say that, as Jennifer just related, one of the effects of the hurricane was a massive emigration from Puerto Rico. I could say that, the 3 months following Maria's landfall saw an exodus of people from the island, and I will not, tread over that terrain since, Jennifer did a wonderful job on outlining that. I will say that participants in the Holyoke study confirmed the estimates with the bulk of persons displaced by the hurricane arriving in Western Massachusetts between October and December 2017, with a noticeable increase in returns to the island starting in January 2018. But among the most noticeable and relevant findings of the report, I will tell you that the top 3 reasons, as you can imagine, the top 3 reasons, as you can imagine, for leaving Puerto Rico for Holyoke were damage on uninhabitable homes, the lack of steady income or employment, and lack of food. People were actually hungry as one of the reasons why they were forced to leave the island. And this chart presents a few of the other reasons that people mention as forcing them to leave the island. The majority of people displaced from the island and arriving in Holyoke, they relied on key networks, and that is friends and families who provided them with support in addressing their needs. One point that I like to underscore here is that given the socioeconomic standings of Puerto Ricans that resided in Holyoke, I will say that the brunt of the burden of giving refuge, hosting these persons displaced from Puerto Rico were working class Puerto Ricans and Puerto Ricans living in poverty. And I will remark even further that one of the characteristics of the Holyoke is that it is a community with the largest concentrations of Puerto Ricans in the United States. Nearly half the population of Holyoke is Puerto Rican. And not only that, it is also a community with great economic need, given by the fact that Puerto Ricans in New England generally, and in Massachusetts specifically, have the highest rates of poverty and the lowest rates of household income in the entire country. So of all Puerto Ricans in the United States, those located and settled in Massachusetts tend to be the worst off socioeconomically. Yet, in spite of the great economic disadvantages, the Puerto Rican community in Holyoke rallied to respond, first by providing material assistance to friends, family, and the entire communities in Puerto Rico, and then by opening their homes to relatives and friends that were displaced in the aftermath of the storm. So these key networks, friends and family that, were in Massachusetts, as well as all over the United States, but the focus here is on Massachusetts, were the first line of defense once Puerto Ricans arrived in the United States. And as you can see here in this chart, who did you relate the most to address the needs that you had upon arriving in the United States? Certainly 38%, the bulk of respondents mentioned relatives and friends, followed by doing it on their own. People were making it out on their own. So about 50%, more than 50%, 60% almost, of people who were displaced by the storm and ended up in Massachusetts, had to rely on their own resources or resources of their key networks. Resources from the government, et cetera, were not as prominent, although still, not trivial either. The various levels of government encouraged Puerto Ricans to leave the island and travel to cities in Holyoke. So we encountered respondents who told us that the mayor of the town in Puerto Rico told them to leave, that people from FEMA told them to get on the plane and go and seek aid in the United States. And organizations such as the Red Cross also encouraged some people to leave the island. And, many people made the decision. Most of the people who left Puerto Rico left because they made the decision to leave Puerto Rico. It's a circumscribed decision because they were forced to, they were compelled to by economic circumstances, by life and death circumstances, and many left because they thought that they would find resources in the United States, or because the United States would provide them with more economic opportunities such as work, housing, healthcare, etc. Displaced Puerto Ricans resided in Holyoke and in Western Massachusetts view the city of Holyoke as a resource. So Holyoke was a resource precisely because it had a high concentration of Puerto Ricans, because there were many Puerto Ricans in the town that provided a level of assistance to these displaced Puerto Ricans. The federal government's response to the disaster was essentially inadequate and at times exacerbated and created new crises for Puerto Ricans in the United States and for Puerto Rican communities in the United States and for communities in which Puerto Ricans in the United States live, for the government of those communities. And a fundamental failure in the response to the crisis was the lack of adequate information and data sharing about the needs of displaced migrating Puerto Ricans. The federal government oftentimes refused to share substantive information about the needs of displaced Puerto Ricans with local entities. So you had FEMA engaging in case management in Massachusetts and holding on to the information, not sharing it with the local social service agencies or the local town or the county government that were also providing some level of assistance. So, they might have been working, if not at cross purposes, certainly in the least efficient way possible. In Puerto Rico, in the aftermath of the storm, local governments, the municipal governments were the first line of response to the disaster, but the ability of municipal governments in Puerto Rico to coordinate beyond those municipalities, beyond their jurisdiction, was fairly limited, admired by the lack of capacity, lack of efficacy, corruption, preparation, and lack of resources. So they were relying on local resources to attend to the crisis, but they were insufficient once those municipalities had to attend to issues beyond their jurisdiction because it was not their jurisdiction, out of jurisdiction. Communal solidarity, was a key dimension in the positive response to the disaster in Puerto Rico and in the city of Holyoke. So the sense among Puerto Ricans, both in Puerto Rico, but specifically in Holyoke, that we had to take care of our own, that we had to take care of our people, was a great asset that Puerto Ricans had in responding to the crisis. So this sense of solidarity was a resource that could be tapped for future resources. However, there are limits to what that communal solidarity, to what that sense of solidarity can provide. It does not make up for a lack of material resources. It is something that you can tap on. This sense of solidarity, it is something that you must tap on and rely on to provide assistance, but it cannot make up for lack of material resources. And that is something that became very evident in Holyoke. The civic sector, whether civic organizations, religious organizations, secular organizations, provided substantive but limited support to Puerto Ricans in the island as well as the United States. So the civic sector became a very important component providing assistance for people in Puerto Rico and in Puerto Rican communities in the United States. The biggest need by far that displaced Puerto Ricans encountered was affordable and accessible housing. As we can see here, the chart presents us with the most important needs that Puerto Ricans that travel to the Western Massachusetts area encounter. So we see housing, 44% of Puerto Ricans encounter housing as the biggest issue. Unemployment was also very high up. Access to medical care and not enough income for one's family, were pretty significant also as a need when they came to Massachusetts. Once accessible or access to affordable housing was achieved, that tended to stabilize displaced families. So once people who migrated as a result of the hurricane, they were able to find housing, they were able to stabilize many other aspects of their life, whether it was finding a job, actually getting to school, access to healthcare, etc. And many, even though many of the respondents said that they relied on key networks, on their friends and family to tend to their needs in Massachusetts, there is no question about the fact that many also relied on civic organizations, governmental agencies, churches, etc., and they found them to be fairly useful in tending to their needs. So the reliance on an existing stock of resources, not just at the individual or family level, but at the community level, is also very important to tend to the needs of people displaced by catastrophes such as the ones that we encounter with Hurricane Maria. However, even though you may have had this stock of resources available, respondents, when they're seeking aid, they cannot make the distinction between the federal government, the state government, the city government, particularly if they're coming from Puerto Rico, and they cannot distinguish whether a city is a city agency or a state agency. Yes, they may know FEMA, they may know Social Security, but beyond that, they may not know whether an agency is even a governmental agency. They may not know whether the local social service agency is non-governmental, but rather private, but with a contract from the state perhaps to provide assistance. Ultimately, the majority of people displaced by the hurricanes that relied on governmental services found the assistance provided by the government of Massachusetts and the city of Holyoke very useful. Social service agencies were an important lifeline for tending to the needs. What is interesting is that, again, because the Puerto Rican population in Massachusetts tend to be not very well off, and the people displaced by the hurricane tended to be the most vulnerable initially prior to the storm, and that vulnerability translated itself in great need. When they traveled from Puerto Rico to Holyoke, many of those Puerto Ricans who traveled from the island seeking refuge to Holyoke encountered conditions for the Puerto Rican community in Holyoke, which were also pretty dire. So they got compounded. And many of the needs that displaced Puerto Ricans encounter once they arrived in Massachusetts came to be fairly similar to the ones that Puerto Ricans in Massachusetts who were there prior to the storm already encountered. Many of them were also, for instance, not enough food for their families, not enough income for their families, the rent being too high. I must point out to the fact that housing in Holyoke, Massachusetts is very tight. It's a very tight rental market. Therefore, people who resided in Holyoke prior to the storm were themselves encountering very tough housing conditions. What was successful in light of all of these conditions was the creation of a central place or resource center that provided access to the various federal agencies, local agencies, and resources for an extended period of time under the umbrella of one-stop shopping. There was a family resource center in Holyoke that became the hub of service provision in Western Massachusetts. And that did not make things easy, but it made things certainly easier because it concentrated information, resources, and know-how to an extent that would not have existed that did not exist in other places in Western Massachusetts. Among the providers of assistance, regular meetings was very important in coordinating the delivery of services. And finally, the sense of solidarity that existed not just within the Puerto Rican community, but within the civic sector and the governmental sector in Holyoke became very important. It facilitated the workings among themselves in time of high strain, high demand for their services. So standing patterns of cooperation, coordination, and communication made it better, not good, but better under very dire circumstances. However, they all faced insufficient resources before and during the response to the crisis presented by people displaced by the hurricane, which hamper an effective response. And to conclude, the example or the lessons that Holyoke can present to the world is the need for preparation and anticipation at the municipal level, since the municipal level is the one that tends to respond for better or for worse, fairly or unfairly. Municipal levels are the ones that oftentimes bear the brunt of the need to respond to this humanitarian crisis. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation.
Thank you so much, Carlos. This was a great presentation. Many of the questions that are related to your presentation, you sort of answered, but let me first, congratulate you and Charles Venator for completing what I think is a good example of how localities, best practice of how municipalities and local agencies can respond to people that migrate to that area as a response to the disaster, particularly in Puerto Rico. So this the best practice at community level, which is to create this hub of services, goes to some of the questions that people are asking. For example, there were 3 questions that are directly related to the housing issue. One of them is, first, what about shelters? Are there still people in that situation where they haven't found housing, and what is the role of the state and the local government and the agencies and so forth? The second one is related to the fact that in many areas they don't know what Puerto Ricans are, and they treat them as foreign, or you have your green card. And what that does is create barriers for access to programs, right? So you alluded a little bit to that, but if you can clarify that. And the other, obviously, the cost of real estate in the area, you also alluded to that. But those were the questions that I think are related a little bit to the factual part of your presentation.
Certainly, as I mentioned before, The housing market in Western Massachusetts, but in Holyoke in particular, is very tight. There is a very low vacancy rate even before the hurricane, right? And even though Holyoke, Massachusetts, in and of itself, is not a booming city, meaning it has gone through a lot of the deindustrialization that the entire Northeast and Midwest has gone through. So it is a city that now is beginning to gain in population, but that is also creating pressures on the existing housing stock, which also, because it tends to be pretty old, is not in the best condition. So, you know, it tends to be limited, it tends to be old and in need of repairs, and nevertheless, rents are very high. And this is something that Puerto Ricans who lived there before the hurricane encounter. So imagine how things got compounded once displaced families arrived in Holyoke. Many families that came from the island ended up staying with other family members. So yes, there were many hotels, not necessarily shelters. FEMA made use of existing hotels in the Hampden County area to house folks that were displaced by the storm in Puerto Rico. But that was temporary. It is a temporary shelter assistance program. And after a period of 3 months initially, and then 6 months, and almost nearly a year, that assistance ended. Over time, at least by the vast majority of people that we either interview or conducted focus groups with, they had stabilized their housing situation either because they found an apartment on their own, or they were able to live with family members for an extended period of time. So are there people still in shelters? There may still be a few people that are somehow relying on temporary shelter assistance, but the program pretty much ended after a year after the storm. And I think that there was a third point, which I forget now.
Well, the whole question of the access to the programs and the role of the hub.
I don't know. I mean, the role of the hub was like one of the, we also conducted focus groups with social service organizations and the civic sector in Holyoke. And one of the participants thought that it was a brilliant idea to have everything under one roof, which, by the way, it was also replicated in Puerto Rico. There were municipalities that en la cancha de recreo, they actually brought together all the services that a municipality could provide, and also bring in the assistance from either the Red Cross or FEMA or what have you. So creating a hub where you can concentrate resources, and I'm talking about material resources, and I'm talking about know-how, and I'm talking about perhaps coordination among themselves, facilitated greatly the provision of services for families in need. That is possibly one of the biggest takeaways from the report. In terms of best practices, whether what we highlighted in the report is replicable, well, that is the intent. The intent, this study came about as a result of an application that the city of Holyoke made to the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program in order for them to prepare for climate change driven events. So they were hoping, and they're still hoping, to be able to collect this information and adapt their findings so that they can be prepared for this type of event and any other type of event, because, anecdotally, my co-author, Charles Venator Santiago from El Instituto, has heard that many of the learnings that came out of this report have actually been influential in providing responses to the pandemic, creating this one-stop shop approach to responding to a crisis, where you can have a hub of services. Under this particular pandemic, however, that can also be somewhat difficult because you don't want to congregate a lot of people in one geographical space, in keeping with social distancing. But the point is that, yes, we do hope and we believe that many of the findings of this study and the response that the city of Holyoke and its civic sector and governmental sector is replicable. In terms of the replacing of the population. As Jennifer has indicated in the reports that she has produced, there has been a steady erosion of the population in Puerto Rico since 2004, since just before the beginning of the economic crisis, coinciding with the economic crisis that, as we know, started in Puerto Rico in 2006. So from 2005 on, there has been a decline of the population in Puerto Rico. One thing that we did notice as a result of the 2019 American Community Survey one-year estimate results is that, yes, the Puerto Rican population, the population in Puerto Rico decreased by 1,400 people. You know, there was a decrease in the population. However, the Puerto Rican population in Puerto Rico decreased by 25,000 people. So there is a difference of about 23,000 people that are non-Puerto Ricans who are on the island, who were not here before. So in response to the interviews that Sandra was mentioning, she has conducted recently, I suspect this is something that we need to do a little bit more research on, that there may be a response to Ley 20, Ley 22, that the government of Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth government created to try to incentivize the immigration to the island. Well, there might be an opportunity for people who are bringing in capital to settle in Puerto Rico and take advantage of the tax exemptions that the government of Puerto Rico and the U.S. federal government might provide. So is there a replacing of the population? Well, it's a little bit too soon to tell, but there is one indicator that suggests that may be taking place. But we must remember something. 95% of the population of Puerto Rico is Puerto Rican. And 92% of the population of Puerto Rico is Puerto Ricans born in Puerto Rico. So, you know, let's not go overboard and think that, you know, Puerto Ricans are being replaced willy-nilly, because the overwhelming majority, 9 persons out of 10 in Puerto Rico, are Puerto Ricans born on the island, okay? And so I have a couple of other answers, but I want to give a chance to both Sandra and Fernando to provide answers themselves.
Fernando?
I will say, in regards to your questions about cross-racial coalitions, Edwin, that certainly at the elite level and at the governmental level, there was a strong response from non-Puerto Ricans to the destruction in Puerto Rico at the state level, at the local levels. In New York City, in New York State, in the state of Massachusetts, in the state of Connecticut and New Jersey and Florida, and I'll let Fernando speak to that if he wants to, there was an immediate, almost automatic, reflexive response. And I think that comes from the fact that Puerto Ricans represent important segments of the population and of the electorate in those states. So more than a solidarity-like affinity and response that they may have come from these political elites, which I think that there was also the calculated effort that comes from building a political power base among Puerto Ricans in these states, in these cities, in these towns, that then resulted in perhaps more attention from governmental authorities more broadly. In states where you have fewer Puerto Ricans with less arraigo, with less roots in the community, and perhaps political weight, there was not so much of a response, I would say. Certainly within the non-for-profit sector in Holyoke and in surrounding communities, there was a lot of solidarity, but because these are social sectors that were already interacting with each other and they knew each other. And so it was an easy transition, well, not an easy transition, but it was an easier transition to make.